Yeah, sure, of course. Thanks, Mona. Thanks so much for this talk and for, yeah, I've seen it before. I've read the slides before, so it was nice to actually hear the words that come with it. Yeah, so Mona proposed sort of three different ways in which one can escape this conflict or this dilemma that Friedman proposes, and then said some words about each of them and why they are not satisfactory as they stand. And I also want to raise sort of three questions or three thoughts that I think are very much in the same spirit as Mona's solution in the end. So these are more sort of supplementary things to think about rather than, aims at sort of devastating objections. And as Mona was saying, I think many people sort of had this reaction to reading the puzzle to start with, which was that we were not quite convinced that there actually is a conflict here. And I'm still not entirely sure that there is a conflict here. And so the first thing I was thinking is this first principle that's really important to get the conflict going, or get the puzzle going, KPA. Is it actually true in the way it's formulated? Is that the correct principle? Because the way it is presented is as a sort of obvious, well, not trivial, but sort of uncontroversial principle. But yeah, if you think about it a bit more, I'm not actually sure if we should accept it the way it is. And so, just to recall, this is the principle. If you're in a position to know a proposition, then you're also permitted to come to know that proposition. So I was thinking about scenarios where you sort of come to, you are in a position to know something that you're not permitted to know. So for example, you might work for some government agencies and there's all kinds of different security clearances in place. Say you work late at night and you sort of walk down the corridor to get some coffee and you happen to overhear the conversation between two of your colleagues who have much higher clearance than you do. And there's pieces of information that are being exchanged that you are not normally permitted to know about. But it seems like you are now in a position to know these propositions because you have the evidence, you've sort of heard what people are talking about. And yet it seems like, yeah, you're not really permitted to come to know these things, and so I think what scenarios like this sort of raises the question whether we need to specify KPA a bit more and really be precise about the type of permission we're talking about here. So maybe there's a confusion that might arise by confusing various types of permission, and maybe what we really talk about here is epistemic permission rather than sort of full, like just sort of garden variety normative permission. But if that's the case, I think we need to say a bit more about what epistemic permission is, how it's different from other types of permission, and how it relates to other types of permission, in particular in terms of the reactive attitudes that are adequate when someone does something that they're not permitted to do from an epistemic or non-epistemic point of view. So that's the first thing I just want to raise. How plausible is KPA as it stands? And if it's not that plausible, then maybe the puzzle has a harder time getting off the ground to start with. And the second question is, again, very much in line with some of the things Mona was saying. She was already mentioning this. You might just think that there is no conflict here. You might be very skeptical of this suggestion. And that's because normally when we talk about deontic conflicts, they're very, very structured, right? You have the same deontic notion or property that applies to someone, and it's about the same content. So you have phrases like I ought to pee and I ought not to pee. So I'm required to pee and I'm required not to pee. And those are, standard conflicts. And it's really unclear what I should do. It seems like I can't sort of escape the conflict. Well, no matter what I do, I'm violating some sort of norm. And as it stands, the two principles that are important here in Friedman's case don't really seem to fit that mold, because there's just a lot of things going on that are very different. So we don't have that very clear structure. So to start with, we have different deontic notions that are in play. KPA is formulated in terms of permission. ZIP is formulated in terms of ought. Mona has already mentioned this. And then also the content to which these notions apply is different. So in KPA, we have a proposition P. In ZIP, we have Q, which might be a question or a set of questions. Since that's a normative inquiry, it might be something a lot broader. So there's these differences here that mean that the sort of clear-cut conflict that we probably would be expecting in a case like this doesn't quite present itself. Now, as Mona mentions, forget the slide numbers, these are no longer accurate. There's a way of maybe making those two principles fit that standard mold of conflict a bit better. So we might, sorry, did I? No, yeah. We might actually, think a bit more about what are the different deontic notions at play, and are they actually standing in, are they in conflict with each other? And so one way to get out of this is to say, well, we have an obligation on the one hand and permission on the other hand, and obligations just trump permissions. It's very clear what you should do, and that's all we need to say. But maybe we can say even a bit more. So it seems like this sort of trumping response is implicitly accepting that there is a conflict to start with, and it just tells us how to get out of it. But maybe we can even sort of escape that entire line of thought by just saying, look, a permission is a take it or leave it affair. So whether you do or don't do what you're permitted to do is entirely up to you. It doesn't have any other consequences than that. And so we don't even need to appeal to some sort of deontic hierarchy of what trumps what to get out of this conflict. So that would be a first reaction we might have. And then one might also say that, okay, that might be one of the issues, but what we're actually after is some sort of clear-cut conflict that is concerned with the same normative notion, with the same deontic notion. So let's just change the principle such that we have the same notion that's in play here. Let's just change it to an ought. And that's also something that Mona discusses in her talk. And I think even if we do that, we still don't get the sort of clear-cut conflict that the puzzle suggests, or that Friedman's paper suggests, because even though we now have consistency in terms of deontic notions, we still don't have consistency in terms of content, or in terms of the propositions that these normative notions apply to. So if we fill this out in line with the case, you get something like this. So if I'm engaging in an inquiry aimed at figuring out how many windows the building has, then I ought to take the necessary means to figuring this out. And then one application of KPB might be, if I'm in a position to know a proposition, namely that there is a blue hot dog van outside of the station, then I ought to come to believe that there is a blue hot dog van outside of the station. And so if that's all we have, again, I think the conflict does not really present itself. That just is not enough to really establish that there's a conflict here, that there's something that we can't mutually satisfy. So it seems like what we need to spell out more to really get this idea of conflict going is the necessary means aspect of zip. And so we need to include something like, it's a necessary means to figuring out how many windows the building has that I do not look left or right to what's happening to me, something like that, right? And then that way maybe we can get closer to this actual notion of conflict. But then I think we already sort of leave the general realm, and then we're already in the case specific realm. And then we have to do a bit more work again to sort of motivate why, or whether it's actually the case that the necessary means to figuring out how many windows the building has include really not coming to know things that sort of are happening in my peripheral vision, that I might not even have to do any epistemic work to really pick up on and come to believe. So all of this, I think, just sort of take some motivation away from this initial puzzle, this initial conflict that Friedman proposes, and might make it and motivates in turn the idea that epistemic norms and synthetic norms are maybe much more compatible than as it seems. At the very least, I think we're moving away from this claim that there are large scale normative conflicts between those two normative domains. All we can say, I think, at this point is that there might be some cases. And this will depend a lot on like what the necessary means are that are involved in those cases. But that's already a win, I think, for anyone who is in the camp of epistemic norms and norms of inquiry are the same, or are at least compatible, point in the same directions. Okay, and just a couple more words about Mona's solution. So as you've all just heard, Mona also thinks that there is no conflict here, and her way to motivate that, or to solve the puzzle, is to instead focus on in a position to know and not the necessary means part. Yeah, so she chooses KPB as her target, and then puts in her definition of what it is to be in a position to know. And then the result of that is that according to this definition, we are not in a position to know that there is a blue hot dog van next to the station. And so the conflict disappears because KPB simply doesn't apply. So instead of denying that there is a conflict when both notions apply, her way out is to say, well, one of them actually doesn't apply. So there's only one norm in place here, and we can satisfy that. That's not an issue. And so a question I have here is whether that really is a general solution to the problem or a general denial of EZ conflicts, or whether it's more a case-specific reaction to this specific puzzle, where all we can say is, look, in this particular case, there is no conflict here between the two kinds of norms because one of them actually doesn't apply because you misunderstood what it means to be in a position to know. And maybe we want more than that. Maybe we want a reply to this puzzle that sort of assumes that both norms actually apply, and then tells us that there still is no conflict, or that there's a conflict that we can resolve quite easily. Yeah, so that would be my question. Why, or is this enough for what the sort of knowledge first bigger project really wants? Or maybe that's just shooting for too much, right? Maybe the sort of related question here is, well, how general of a denial do we need of these EZ conflicts? Maybe it's enough that we can exclude many cases and still have some cases. Yeah, so those are my thoughts. And again, thanks so much, Mona, for giving us this talk.
So I totally agree with 90% of what you said. So I think that one lesson that I learned from your response is that I need to move the discussion of permission versus obligation towards the beginning of this paper, because if people do have this reaction that you had, as soon as they see the puzzle, they're like, there's no puzzle, what's wrong with this person? And is she confused? People are just not going to listen to the rest of the talk until I come to the point where I say, actually, yes, the puzzle as stated is not quite right, and so on. So I think that in the talk, but also in the written paper, I should move this part of the discussion right in the beginning in order to basically get rid of this suspicion that all normatively well-trained people like yourself will have from the very beginning when they look at this puzzle. So that's what I plan to do about that. I agree, you're right, there's no trumping, there is no conflict to begin with, therefore there can't be trumping. That was just a mistake on my part. I completely agree. I'm going to change that. Thanks so much. Spelling out the content, I completely agree, and thanks for doing half of the work for me. I need to do that when I write the paper. The paper doesn't exist, it's still just a talk, so I need to spell it out a bit further. I think that it's intuitive that there's going to be conflict there, but I also agree that it's always useful to kind of spell out what the conflict is exactly about, because we might discover things that we don't see if we don't spell it out properly. Indeed, I think that we need to spell out what the necessary means are and spell it out in a way in which it becomes clear that if I take those necessary means, i.e. focusing only on counting or something like that, that's going to be coming in conflict with me forming beliefs about men in green hats that are leaving the station. Completely agree with that. One worry that you have is, as soon as we spell out the conflict, is this still going to generalize, or is it just going to be case specific? Because if it's just case specific, maybe we don't care that much about counting windows. So, the epistemology of window counting might not be very, a very interesting field. I think it will still generalize, because I think the puzzle is an in-principle puzzle. We have only so much in the way of cognitive resources. If we spend them all on doing this particular thing that we need to do in order to figure out, the answer to a question, we can't come to know all this other stuff that's happening around us. Or, it doesn't even need to be a take it or leave it type of absolute terms. It can be that because I'm focusing on giving this talk now, I can still come to know some of this stuff, as you were saying, that doesn't take much cognitive resource, that I can see in the periphery of my visual field, but not all the stuff that I am normally in a position to come to know if I'm not focusing on giving a talk, right? So I think that even if we spell it out, it will still generalize, because it's an in-principle kind of issue. As soon as I start inquiring into something, I'm going to have less cognitive resource to focus on what's happening around me. That's the puzzle, right? And because it's going to generalize, I think that my solution to it is also an in-principle solution. So in response to your last point, which is the solution only going to apply to cases in which KPP doesn't apply because your cognitive resources are spent on the counting? No, the solution is going to generalize in the following way. Since obligations are grounded in being in a position to know, both on my view and on James, as soon as I'm not in a position to know something, I don't have the obligation anymore. So again, no matter how the case is spelled out, whether now that I'm inquiring into whether P, I can still come to know a couple of things from my environment, or none, or 12 things from my environment, this doesn't really matter. What matters is that in all of these cases, my cognitive resources will be more limited for coming to know stuff around me when I engage in an inquiry into a particular matter. And the question is, of permissibility, what's the permissibility situation in that case? And my solution is an in principle kind of solution. You can never be obligated to come to know as many things as you could had you not been inquiring into this thing, because you can't be subject to this conjunctive obligation if you are not in a position to know the conjunction of all of these things. So I think that the Friedman case will generalize, but the good news is that my account will follow suit, as it were. Yeah, thanks. This was extremely helpful, Lisa. Thanks so much.
All right, and Wes? So I originally wrote all this out, so I might have to refer to what I actually wrote at some point to make sure I say it the same way. I'm not convinced that I will, but we're going to go for it. So we have the conflict with 1 through 3. The difficulty obviously is that if you have epistemic and zetetic norms overlapping, but those conflict to a great degree, then that's going to undermine internal harmony. That means at least one of these has to be false. Now, it could be the multiple are false, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be that 2 of them are true, but at least one of them has to be false. So we have to figure out what to reject. Now, I think an important part of how to solve the puzzle also, so I think Mona gives us some constraints in terms of like the particular cases we look at. So we need a solution to Chrysler Building. It's not clear that there's any particular solution we need to Chrysler Building, but we at least need something plausible to say about it. So it's not like, oh, like we have to get so-and-so a result. We just have to say like, how in the midst of Chrysler Building do we, reject 1 through 3? It's a way of kind of fleshing out the puzzle. Now, with 2 other cases, though, we have verdicts that we're kind of supposed to get, right? So we have the sexist scientist case, and the thought here is that the belief that the sexist scientist bill comes to is unjustified. So whatever our solution is to the puzzle, like we still have to have it that bill is unjustified. And Mona claims that because he's unjustified, this shows he violated some kind of epistemic norm. Now, Mona's diagnosis of the case is that there's something wrong with how Bill inquires. So Bill should do something like, so let's see here, how did I phrase it here? Bill ought to take up the question as to whether his experiment is flawed. So that's kind of the norm he violates, is that he ought to take up the question of whether his experiment or his judgment is flawed. And that's what's going wrong in this case. That's why he ends up unjustified. But because he ends up unjustified, that violation of a norm of inquiry must affect him in an epistemic way as well. So whatever we say, we got to get the judgment that Bill is unjustified in his belief. All right, the other judgment we got to get is that Dr. X is unjustified in their belief. Now, Dr. X thinks that ulcers are caused by stress, but due to recent research, it's become clear that that's not the case. It's actually caused by H. pylori. And so we're going to need the result that Dr. X is unjustified in his belief that ulcers are caused by stress. Now we get a similar thing going on here where if Dr. X is unjustified, that means he must have violated something epistemic, but it seems like he did something wrong in terms of inquiry, where he didn't continue looking into the latest research like he should as a doctor. So we get this violated as a zetetic norm, yet he's unjustified. So there must be some kind of epistemic link there. Perhaps that norm is an epistemic norm as well. All right, so we're trying to get a solution that gives us these results. And so before we move on, I want to ask if these are definitely the results we want to try and get. So the first question would be about the sexist scientists. So my thought is the sexist scientist seems to me to be someone who, yeah, sure, they inquire badly, but it doesn't seem to me that we have to apply to a zetetic norm in order to explain why they're unjustified. Instead, it just seems like sexist scientists doesn't respect their evidence. So, they got the first order evidence, how the experiments went, and then they have this higher order evidence, the testimony of Anna, and they just fail to heed the higher order evidence. Now, if we're trying to get the result that Bill is unjustified in his belief, I think this is kind of all we need. We see that he has all the evidence, yet he didn't, respect some of the evidence. So that's the end of the story. I'm not quite so sure why we need to appeal to a zetetic norm in order to explain why Bill's belief is unjustified. So that's kind of my first question for Mona is why I think that this is a case of zetetic failure and not just one of epistemic failure. Why do we need the zetetic norm as well to explain what's unjustified about what happened here? All right, the second question I have is about Dr. X. And I think that Dr. X, is a case where I think it's clear that there was a norm of inquiry violated. So unlike sexist scientists, I think here we are clearly dealing with a failure of a zetetic norm. And the norm, something like you need to stay up to date on the latest research or something of that sort. Now, what I'm not convinced of is I'm not convinced that Dr. X's belief that ulcers are caused by stress is unjustified. And here's why. So you picture Dr. X's situation, all the things they've ever read say that ulcers are caused by stress. And sure, they stopped reading the literature 5-10 years ago. But if you're a doctor and you didn't read any literature in the last 5 or 10 years, that doesn't yield all of your medical beliefs unjustified, right? You're still justified in the beliefs you had then. You might lower your confidence a little bit. You might say I should look into that if I'm going to prescribe medicine or something like that. But you don't automatically fail to be justified in all of those beliefs you had just because you haven't kept up on the research. Now, let's say Dr. X in the face of the evidence, believed that, ulcers were caused by H. pylori, even though he doesn't really have that in mind, right? Even though he doesn't have any evidence to support that conclusion. That would be very strange to me. I would think that would be a paradigmatically unjustified belief. So I think my question is, what is Dr. X justified in believing here? And, could it be that he's justified in believing that ulcers are caused by stress? But we actually have a zetetic failing where he didn't inquire in the right way. So I kind of wonder if our diagnosis of these cases is correct. Okay, so now we're going to move on to something else. I'm not going to rehearse Mona's solution here. I want to instead talk about another solution. Now, fortunately, David Thorstad has been able to join us today because pretty much the rest of my comments are inspired by David, so maybe he can just jump in when I get it wrong. But essentially what we have is a solution offered to this puzzle in a recent paper by David. So David's puzzle solution is to reject, well, depending on how you look at it, it might reject multiple of the parts of the puzzle. So I think kind of the principal part of the solution we need to know is that we can have oughts directed at different parts of our kind of decision-making and action process. So one way to get kind of a handle on this is with this example, lake. All right, so Mudge passes a child drowning in a lake. She decides to flip a coin and saves the child just in case the coin lands heads. The coin lands heads, Mudge saves the child. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, in one sense, Mudge did the right thing. We would say she did what she ought to do. She saved the child. But in another sense, she did something wrong. She inquired in a way she ought not have inquired, or chose a decision procedure that she ought not to have used. So there are two different places we can evaluate what Mudge does, how Mudge decides, and what Mudge ultimately ends up doing. And what David calls these focal points. So we can have oughts that are attached to different focal points. So on the one hand, Mudge did what she ought to have done. On the other hand, she decided in a way she ought not have decided. Now, fortunately, it worked out. She saved the child, but there was something that went wrong here. And so this just is an example to show that we can target kind of different focal points with our oughts. Now, the question then for Mona would be, is this like a live possibility? What does she think about this potential solution? So how would this go in the Chrysler building case, right? Well, it would say something like this. Let's say you stopped counting the windows and you believe something else, that there's a man in a red hat coming out of Grand Central Station. Well, in that case, you didn't inquire as you ought. You had a goal. You wanted to count the windows on the Chrysler building, and you kind of failed when it came to the zetetic norm. You inquired badly. But given the evidence you had that you saw this man in the red hat, all of that, you believed as you ought. So given the evidence you had, you believed as you ought, but you failed zetetically in that you violated this norm of inquiry. Now, what kind of a solution is this? Well, it can be multiple kinds of solution, right? So it can deny one. It can say that the epistemic and the zetetic aren't the same. Epistemic norms target the beliefs you actually have, and then zetetic norms target the process you use to get there. So this view can solve the puzzle by denying one. It can also deny two, depending on how you look at it, right? So like, is it a conflict if your inquiry tells you to do one thing and your evidence tells you to believe another? Maybe that's a kind of inquiry, or maybe it's a kind of conflict, but it's not a direct conflict, like Lisa said, where you ought P and then ought not P at the same time. So as a question about whether this kind of view might be plausible. And then I was thinking that, like, let's apply this to Dr. X now. So let's roll it back. My interpretation of Dr. X was he inquired badly, but he believed as he should, given the evidence he had. And I think this is like a kind of plausible like interpretation of Dr. X. And we can do that with this focal point view. So we can say, yeah, Dr. X inquired badly, given that he's a doctor. He should have stayed up to date on the latest research. But given the evidence he had, everything he has says that ulcers are caused by stress. He believed as he ought, given the evidence. Okay, I have one more case and then one more question, and then we will be done. All right, so this is another case that David has in his paper. I thought it was really interesting, and I just wanted to see what the in a position to know view would say about it. So we have here, boss runs a large research factory. Boss is rude and abusive towards her employees. As a result, boss's employees provide boss with abundant evidence that they do not love her. But if boss forms the belief that she is unloved, she will be much less productive and as a result, fail to resolve many important questions at work. To avoid this, boss ignores evidence and her employees dislike and does not form the belief that she is unloved. All right, so what do we have going on here? Here we have another conflict between a zetetic and an epistemic norm, but this is in the reverse. So before we were looking at ones where it's like, oh, well, in order to like inquire as you ought, you just kind of have to, go about with the task you're doing. You can't look over there and start to form another belief. Now we have boss who has all this evidence right in front of her, the permission to form a belief, and it'd be seemingly permitted to form the belief that she's unloved. But if she does that, that's going to undermine future inquiry. So if she forms that belief, she's not going to work well as a team. They might not discover all the things they need to. And so for the sake of inquiry, she might have to not obey this epistemic permission. Now, here's a question then for Mona's account. It seems like the boss is in a position to know that she's unloved. But if she goes and believes that, and if she ought to believe it, then that's going to conflict with, this ought of maybe inquiry, this ought where she needs to like continue having a productive work life in order to go on to discover more things with her research lab. So, this isn't necessarily an objection. I just wanted to hear what Mona has to think about this, like how this works with her view, just learn a little bit more about the in a position to know view. And that's all I got. Thank you so much for the great paper.
All right, thanks, Wes. Mona, please.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Again, I'm going to try to go through all of the objections. I hope I don't take too much time. Paul, if I do, just please stop me. Yeah, thanks a lot, Wes. This was fantastic. The amount of work that both of you put in this is absolutely humbling. So I'm just gonna, try to do justice to all of your comments. So the first thing is, do we have to say that in the sexist scientist case is a breach of a zetetic norm? No, we don't. We as people, we don't. I think actually we shouldn't. I think we should have the result that you suggested, that it's a breach of, updating based on available evidence. The problem is, which is something that I couldn't get into the talk because there's not enough time. The problem is that we don't really have accounts of evidence on the market that are going to predict that, other than my own, which is a fantastic account. So I mentioned Tim Williams's account a lot in my talk. So if you think evidence is knowledge, you're going to think Bill doesn't have the evidence that there's something wrong with his experiment, because knowledge implies belief and he doesn't believe it because sexism, right? So on Tim's view, Bill doesn't have evidence that there's something wrong with his experiment. I have an entire paper about all accounts of evidence in the literature that I could find. It is known, it's written in the beginning of the Stanford Encyclopedia article on evidence, that most accounts of evidence that we have in epistemology are state of mind based. So they involve minds. Having evidence is thought in epistemology to have to do with states of minds, either beliefs or more weakly kind of experiences or something like that. We don't have, other than simple indicator reliabilist accounts of evidence, or my view, which is a knowledge first variety of that indicator view. We don't have views on which evidence lies out there in the world and is normatively loaded. And that's the kind of view that you need in order to predict what I agree with you is the intuitive result, that the sexist guy just ignores evidence. He doesn't update as he should. Right? So if you have a view on which evidence is a state of mind, the only way in which you can understand what's happening in that case is that Bill doesn't gather evidence, because he doesn't take up this information from the world into his head. He doesn't form the belief. For a piece of evidence to come to be had by someone, if you think it's a state of mind, it needs to be picked up from the world, right? So it is a breach of a zetetic norm if you think evidence is in the mind, and it's a breach of a straightforward epistemic norm if you think evidence is outside the mind, in a nutshell. Most people think it's in the mind, so it's a problem for them, not a problem for me. About the good doctor, I disagree strongly about the good doctor for two reasons. One is theoretical. It's a classical case of normative defeat. It's not that much about intuition battling here. What you need to shoulder in order to tell me that Dr. X is justified to believe that rubbish thing that he believes about ulcers is you need to deny normative defeat, that it exists. Now, that's a big bullet to bite in order to solve Friedman's puzzle, I think. That is just a standard case. That's the case that proponents of normative defeat, such as Sandy Goldberg and others, cite over and over again, because it's the most intuitive case. They take it, but it's also the standard case. So if you need to deny that an entire epistemic category exists in order to solve this puzzle, maybe we should just live with the puzzle. I think that's a better way to go about it. Also, we can always generate cases if you're unconvinced intuitively by the doctor case, because maybe you sympathize with this poor old guy who doesn't bother to go to conferences anymore. Let's think about worse cases, in which people believe that climate change doesn't happen because they refuse to inquire into the issue, right? They just believe their crazy grandma who tells them that it's cold outside, so there's no such thing as climate change, and they don't inquire further into the issue. Do you think they're justified to believe climate change is not happening just because they're not informed? Also, imagine someone who thinks Trump is a fantastic president because he refuses to watch proper media channels. That's also not a good thing, right? We don't want to say that person is justified to believe that Trump is a good president, right? So again, we can talk about this. I can give you millions and millions of cases until I rigged your intuition in the direction that I wanted to be rigged, as it were. So that's the second claim. Third is the David Thorsten Lake case, right? So it was not clear to me what your question was about the case. But if you want me to just tell you what I think about this way to go, which I gather is roughly what you want from me, and I guess maybe that's also good feedback for David if he's interested in hearing what I have to say. I think that we knew already from basic ethical theory that there are many ways in which one can do normatively better or worse. Utilitarians care about consequences. Kant cares about the intention. That doesn't make it so that it is equally okay. A moral view that cares about intention is equally good as a moral view that cares about consequences. That's why these views are competitors. We need to make a decision. Are we going to care about consequences when it comes to moral goodness, or about the intention? what we care about, similarly in epistemology, is epistemic justification. Of course, we can stipulate normative plurality. There are many ways in which you can do well epistemically, but the interesting question is, which is the one that maps on to epistemic justification? Because that's the one that we care about, right? We want to know when breach of inquiry norms delivers lack of justification. So for that, we need to know which of these different normative properties is the one that maps on to epistemic justification. Similarly, the utilitarians and Kant, I'm sure, agree that consequences are better when they're good, and that intentions are also better when they're good. But the interesting question between them is which one supervenes on moral justification? Is it the good intention or is it the good consequence? And I think that that's what's happening in the lake case. That Kant and the utilitarians can sit on the side of the lake and disagree about whether what went on there was a good or a bad thing. They're both going to agree that there's a plurality of normatively loaded things, but what they're going to disagree about is which of those properties is the relevant one for moral justification. So that's my discussion of the lake case. So no, I don't find it very useful to think in terms of multi-normative foci, because the question at the end of the day is not whether these foci are plausible, I agree they are, but which of these foci is the one that kind of maps on to epistemic justification. So that's another thing. And finally, your last question was about this super interesting case. I love the case where you reverse the way in which zetetic norms and epistemic norms allegedly come into conflict. Love the case. I don't think that it's a proper conflict of E and Z in the way in which the Friedman case is, for two reasons. First, I don't really care about the fact that the woman wants to have a career and it's going to get in the way of her career if she forms those beliefs. That's a practical consideration, not an epistemic consideration. Her career, normativity generated by her career plans, is not normativity that's epistemic. So I think that what epistemology requires of her is to form those beliefs. And if that's going to affect her career, that's going to be practically unfortunate, but epistemically relevant, right? Another thing, though, maybe more helpfully that I want to say is that remember that one thing that I discussed in my talk is the distinction that Kelp likes between norms that are internal to the domain of inquiry, which are zetetic proper, and norms external to the domain of inquiry about inquiring, like the norm go to biology school. The norms that are featured in this case are like that, right? So they're not internal, they're not proper zetetic norms, they're norms about inquiry, which can be practical and moral and so on, right? So I take it that that's a practical norm that says, inquire into whatever you need to inquire for your career. That's a practical norm of inquiry, just like the norm go and play some tennis because it's healthy for you is a practical norm of tennis, not an inside, not a constitutive norm of tennis, right? So that's why I don't think that the case is quite like that. So I don't think that my solution has much to say about it other than, the woman is clearly in a position to know that she's not particularly loved. So and there is absolutely nothing else that she's doing. She's not yet engaged in an inquiry that can put her in an epistemic conflict. She's just in a conflict between a practical norms that tells her to engage in an inquiry and an epistemic norm that tells her to believe that she's not loved. So, epistemically, she should believe that she's not loved. Compatibly, practically, maybe she's better off not doing it. And it is also compatible that the practical norm will override the epistemic, and all things considered, she should maybe not believe if she can abstain at all.
That was today's episode. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Tune in for the next episodes of Figments of the Brain on our SoundCloud page. It's soundcloud.com/brainfigments, or find the podcast on our homepage at www.concept-phil.de.